So this panel is on financing the transformation, investors across the smart protein landscape, right? So what do we mean by financing the transformation? We are trying to transform something which has been there for millennia, right? Meat, eggs, and dairy. Humankind has been having meat, eggs, and dairy products for millions of years. What this sector is trying to do is essentially transform that with innovative products. It's a big challenge. And to finance this kind of transformation, you need mission-aligned, smart investors who are able to support you strategically and not just with financial capital, which is kind of the gist of it. At the same time, you saw from multiple startups who pitched today in the innovation showcase. You heard from more mature companies in the fermentation and cultivated meat, eggs, and dairy and precision fermentation space about their requirements in terms of funding. These are quite varied needs of funding, from early stage startups to more mature startups. So we'll touch base on some of those elements in this session as well. Having said that, in 2020, I think the total funding that went into alt protein was about $3.2 billion, and in 2021 it was $5 billion. We don't have the numbers for 2022 yet, but we can see that over the past 4-5 years, the trajectory has been exponentially growing, which means that a lot of more mission-aligned VCs, private equity players, angel investors have been funding innovative companies. When I started out working within the smart protein, alt protein space, there were probably under 100 companies. Now there are more than 800 which are dedicatedly working on all of these alternative meat, eggs, and dairy products. So the landscape's been booming. At the same time, smart protein offers solutions for 9 out of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, from United Nations, right? It's a call for urgent action to invest in this space so that more companies can come out with superior products in the market, and the path to market and the challenges that are facing the startups in our sector are relatively eased off. Having said that, alternative protein sector, despite of all of this growth, remains quite underfunded, like Varun was mentioning in his talk earlier as well. So what we are hoping to do is essentially stimulate that ecosystem, and we have a fantastic panel to do that. So let's have a huge round of applause for our first panelist for this session, Mr. Rajiv Chitrabhanu. Rajiv Chitrabhanu is the session chair and moderator. I'll invite him up on the stage. Rajiv has been the founder of Magnetic, and also it's a venture and investment firm, and he focuses on operating and advisory. He has backed several unicorns very early in their journey, from companies like Nazara, Lenskart, Porter, Safari Luggage, Rent Mojo, etc. Prior to founding Magnetic, Rajiv was the CEO of JM Financial and JM Morgan Stanley, where he took over 40 companies public and participated in some of the country's largest M&A transactions. Very glad to have you here with us, Rajiv. The second panelist for this panel is Maya Chandrasekaran from Green Artha. Let's invite Maya on up to the stage as well. Maya is the co-founder and managing partner at Green Artha, and she has focused on climate innovation through her investment philosophy. She's also co-founded and continues to actively run the 250 plus member Women in Investing Network, as well as the Climate Capital Network. Maya is an expert at scaling companies that change lives, both as an investor and in practice. Really glad to have you with us, Maya. The next up, we have Mr. Jinesh Shah from Ahimsa VC. I'll invite Jinesh up on the stage as well. Jinesh is the Chief Investment Officer at Ahimsa VC and currently serves as Ahimsa VC is the India's first and only impact venture capital fund focused on disrupting animal agriculture by investing in the future of food, materials, and beyond. Jinesh has founded all protein startups backed by the likes of Khosla Ventures and NBA athletes, and independently advised and consulted dozens of all protein and material startups globally, including Eat Just and Good Dot. And next up, we have Mr. Shreyansh Singhal from Ankur Capital. Let's have a huge round of applause for our three panelists and Shreyansh as well. Shreyansh is the Vice President at Ankur Capital. Shreyansh brings in his experience in research and sourcing early-stage startups from his work at Traction, India and China Geography, and Your Story. He has also worked on capital raising and go-to-market strategies at boutique investment bank Envoy Labs Consulting. He currently leads new investments, portfolio management, and capital raising at Ankur Capital. Next up, we have Mr. Karan from Peak Ventures. Karan Mehta, can I invite you over on stage? Karan Mehta is the principal at Peak Sustainability Ventures. Karan has been involved in impact investing and sustainability for most of his career, with over 15 years of experience in asset management and over 8 years of experience in directly investing in sustainable food and agriculture supply chains across South and Southeast Asia. As principal at Peak Sustainability Ventures, Karan leads deals across energy, water, agriculture, and broader climate technologies. He is a passionate ocean enthusiast and is driven by an inherent desire to revive the planet. We're really glad to have you, Karan. Last but not the least, we have Mr. Pranav Pai from 314 Capital. I'll invite him on the stage as well. Pranav Pai is the founding partner and chief investment officer at 314 Capital and leads investments and portfolio construction at 314 Capital. As CIO, he's led over 70 seed and venture capital investments across several investment categories in India and the US. Currently, 314 Capital manages over $300 million, and its investment include Licious, Open Darwin Box, Better Place, Jupiter, Coup, Doozy, Begin, and Traction. I'm really glad to have you with us as well. So without further ado, let's start with this interesting panel, and on to you, Rajiv.
Hello. Great, thank you all. We've got a good panel over here, experience season. So I thought before I start, maybe just set the context of what they call the TAM or the market opportunity, some of the investments that have happened during this year. So the total size is globally $60 billion and for the alt protein market, and growing at 18% up until the year of 2028. And they estimate by 2035, it will be almost a $290 billion market. So that's the market we're addressing, and over the last 2021, total capital raised was around $5 billion. Out of $5 billion, 1.4 went to cultivated meat, $1.7 billion went to fermented technologies, which includes meat and dairy, and the last 1.9 billion was for plant products, which is milk, dairy, alt meat, seafood. So that's the size, and that's up 60% over last year. That kind of shows the kind of investment that's going in. We have now, I mean, US and Israel have been the leaders in cultivated meat, but we now have 25 countries which have made home to at least one cultivated meat company, which, if you think about 2 years ago, was a controversial topic about cultivated meats. So that's pretty significant. And we have 88 companies now which are focusing on fermented foods, which is either meat or dairy. So with that, with the GFI, I've been working in the region and in India to figure out how do we kind of scale this whole thing from an India context. In order to win, I think it's simple. We just need great tasting products at affordable prices and invest in consumer adoption. So that requires really investment into manufacturing, distribution, branding, some R&D. And I guess that's what we're here to kind of discuss. I just finished a boot camp with a bunch of 14 startups, kind of discussing the same thing. What are the challenges they have, distribution, and how do you bring down the pricing, increase the gross margins. And these are some of the challenges that, again, we hope to address here today. All protein does provide a significant government impetus, also employment, about climate change, a lot of the focuses that are there. But it's kind of sad to see that if you look at the kind of investments that have gone into renewable energy, EV, all protein really hasn't got that same attention. And with the market opportunity globally, I think we hope, and we're gathered here today to figure out how we can accelerate that pace. On the flip side, I think I want to close with two areas which obviously are concerning. One of them is obviously the kind of industrial-sized investments that are required, bioreactor investments that are required. And the second thing is the fact that a lot of the raw materials used so far are predominantly soy, wheat, pea, and that kind of brings us to the question that can we bring about more innovative products like algae, seaweed, duckweed, etc., as sources of ingredients, to create some innovation and probably bring down the price. At Magnetic, we're focused on this space not only because we like consumer health tech, but we see this as a convergence of many other kind of roadmaps that we have, which is sustainability, consumer, and health, So with that, I'm going to kind of start the panel and, kind of take advantage of the experience that we have here today. I guess my first question is to Jinesh, considering the fact that there is so much of focus and transformational investment required, what has the momentum been recently or in the last 18 months, in what you're seeing at Ahimsa?
Sorry, it's working. So first of all, thanks to GFI and Fiki for putting this event together. And not 3 years ago, I was partly in Shardul's footsteps, part MC at the Future of Protein Summit is what we called it then. And at this point now, 3 years later, pardon my voice, I have a bit of a cough. No COVID, so don't worry. But it's great to see now several of the companies that were part of the Innovators Showcase back then have now made leaps. Some of the investors who were on the panel, like Shreyansh, for example, they've made investments in the space with some of these companies. So it's really exciting to see the whole industry sort of come together in India. I've personally been involved in this space since about 2013 in the US and since 2018 in India. So it's just very heartwarming to see the industry coming together with great people on board. With respect to your sort of question about the last 18 months, it's quite pertinent to what we're doing. So at Ahimsa VC, we've been around for just under a year and a half in terms of our existence. And we're again wanting to come into that opportunity which you talked about, which is the lack of capital sometimes in this space that needs to be given to the right worthy entrepreneurs in this space. And in the sustainability field, EVs, et cetera, just take a lot more of that chunk. In the last 18 months, we have, again, we choose to go slow. We're not taking a spray and pray approach. And we just recently closed our fourth investment, for example. So from our perspective, and that's the 4 investments we have go from all the way from whole cut meats to millet-based milk to precision fermentation. And of course, there's also areas we invest in terms of alternative materials, which is where we have that focus. But our primary focus is alternative proteins. In terms of the whole ecosystem and investments overall, I think the fact that we have a panel of active investors here itself today, in this space, and everyone has already, got a foot in this space already, itself is a big change to notice. The government entities are clearly recognizing the importance of plant-based foods, alternative proteins, cellular agriculture, and so are the large sort of corporates as well, right? So we're at a point now, and I know Rajiv has a lot of expertise in many areas, including helping companies sort of exit and sort of grow large. We have so many more exit opportunities because the large companies like the Tatas, the ITCs, all of them are now focused on this space, either putting a leg in this space themselves or are looking for acquisition opportunities. So I think this bodes well for us. And the one key thing, though, I would want the industry to sort of change in terms of the investment side of things, is the term that not a lot of investors in India like, which is patient capital. And I wouldn't want to call that patient capital, but it's more early capital in something that's going to grow big. And I think there is still a lack of that. We're trying to sort of, through our actions, change some of that. 3 of the companies we've invested in out of the 4 are pre-revenue, R&D-driven companies. And I think a bit more of that will definitely sort of help us along the way. But yeah, in terms of the rest of where the industry is going, I think you covered ground really well, Rajiv. Yeah.
Thank you. So Karan, question from Peak. What are some of the basic sustainability conditions that need to be met for interventions in food and ag so that it's a win-win for livelihood and businesses?
Thanks, Rajiv. And again, just thank you to the organizers over here for putting this panel together. Look, for us at Peak, we look at sustainability as an ecosystem. It is not something we look at in silos. That's why we've defined our focus as energy, water, agriculture. Everything within that is interlinked. So you can't think about energy and not think about the impact it'll have on our food systems. So when we're talking about sustainability within food and ag, for us, 3 things really come to mind. How do I do things cleaner? with lesser resources? How do I do things which is more nutrient dense? And the third is how do I maintain biodiversity on farms? These three things are what we're looking to solve within the ag focus of the Peak Sustainability Venture Fund. And for us, alternative proteins fits there very well because it hits all of them, all those three focus areas very cleanly. You mentioned that there are health benefits from just shifting diets. I think we all know that. The data is there. At the same time, we've seen animal agriculture account for 70% of our agriculture resources, but only account for 18% of our calories and only 30% of our protein intake. That to me is a stark, glaring figure. We need to fix that. And that's where our belief is that alternative proteins, or what we call food tech 2.0 or 3.0, whatever number you want to give it. But the future of food for us is going to be nutrient dense, less resource incentive, like much less like resource intensive and clean.
Thank you, Karan. Shreyans, like other impact industries like biotech and agri-tech, what role does capacity building need, or what role does it have here? And what kind of stakeholders do you think, besides investors, need to be involved?
Sure. I think with respect to, as you guys sort of spoke about and setting the context right, in terms of the ecosystem itself is sort of building up together at this point in time. We have models that are sort of yet to be proven in the market, and what we are seeing is the whole of the ecosystem is coming together, right? The right partners in terms of grant agencies, in terms of incubators and accelerators, as well as in terms of larger companies who are sort of providing their resources and starting to look at this segment very closely. What we've seen is that there are different partners who are coming together, trying to sort of effectively build that ecosystem in the alternate protein segment. At Ankur, we've seen that happen across with our portfolio, when we, with respect to one of our companies called String Bio, which was earlier present on the panel. They came from very start, from the BIRAC grant. They got that to sort of kick up and start their positioning in the market through an incubation at C Camp and BBC in Bangalore. They got that first lab set up. They got little bit of trials in place. They got the product out there in the market, which they tested in various labs across the world, got few results, and that's when investors started coming in, and that's when they started taking off to different other parts of the market. And I think for us, when we look at an ecosystem, we look at how different agencies are coming together to be able to sort of take that up forward. Having said that, different startups have their own journey and their own pathway, and we realize that it is about an individual startup to be able to tap into these networks and sort of take it to the next level. And we at Ankur are sort of very collaborative that way, working with different partners in the ecosystem, trying to sort of see how, not just if they are, before even we come in, we actually sort of are able to provide that, not just with capital, but also with providing the next level of growth, particularly with getting participation from these partners who basically can accelerate that growth.
Yeah, thank you. Pranav, at 314 Capital, you guys are looking at many sectors. What are the kind of indicators, trends you need to see, like diet patterns, or what kind of indicators would make this more exciting for you all?
So I think our approach to food has been to not do just what the mainstream is doing a little bit better. For us, the venture scale economics really are clearly visible only when you create something radically different. So for example, the closest company we have to this space is Licious, which thankfully for me on this panel just announced that product they were working on a few days back. It took 2 years to get done. It's difficult to do. This taking Licious as an example, it's incredibly difficult to build what they built. And there is just a taboo around that whole industry. Of course, there's no VC capital available in 2015 for vertical commerce, forget food or that specific part of food. But that's the opportunity for us. So we believe the timing was right. This is an entire vertical category that didn't exist, and we could therefore build the whole supply chain, an Apple of the industry, if you will. We had, in what we thought were the best founders we'd met in the space, and a very clear, radical focus on the end consumer experience. So what I think companies in this space are doing very well now, which is a big change pre-COVID, is they're working backwards from the experience. In the future of food, the D2C variants, for example, a lot more founders are spending time in getting the product, the taste, the feel, the texture right. And then they're working backwards from that on cost and the inputs and which isolate and so on and so forth. So I think we're now seeing the right approach to this category being created. And I hope that that's the signal for all of us on the VC side to take the sector more seriously. I think there's an equally large opportunity in the export market in India. We're blessed with the largest agricultural land area in any country in the world today. We're not yet as efficient as we need to be, and thankfully there's a lot of agri-tech that's trying to improve that. If we're able to get the full stack of from yield to processing to export to work, I think this is going to be a large new area for India to capture. And for the first time, we're not late to a market. Like we've been late to semiconductors, we've been late to EVs. Here, I think we can be one of the first to do it right. So again, just wide-scale opportunity, both B2B and B2C. It's quite an exciting time for the sector, for sure.
I think that's a great point because, we're blessed with agri base, and the input costs really should work in our favor to actually bring down the cost and even be an exporter to the world. Yeah. So, Maya, so you have been focused on renewables and areas of sustainability. So, you've had success in leveraging public financing and establishing proof of concept models. What lessons can we adopt for that in Smart Protein?
So first of all, thanks for having me here. I'll actually break that up into two parts. One is calling out some of the learnings that could be taken from renewables. But I think Shreyans was calling this out as well, that there are also very interesting parallels from a journey perspective if we think about a somewhat more recent industry, which is biotech. And I think both of those are really interesting to learn from in terms of smart proteins. From the perspective of renewables, I think there was a lot of very interesting funding that was provided more from a DFI perspective. And that really helped propel, I would say, early stage infrastructure. And access was, in many cases, funded more from a blended capital perspective. So again, a lot of philanthropic capital came in to provide either the grant funding or the guarantees to enable access to happen. So those are two pools of capital, I think, which are useful to think about. But that said, I think at the point that was happening, renewable energy was already at a different stage of technology readiness for its adoption in India. When I think about biotech, I think that's a little bit more of a corollary to what's possible over here. And there's been some really fantastic support that has been provided. Shreyans called out BIRAC, CCAMP. There aren't enough of those. But those are really, I think, some of the organizations that have helped propel the companies that are now in the market. Additionally, there's been some really great support from concessional grants and concessional funding from the government. So all of those have come together, I think, to create a more conducive investment ecosystem that now the market is able to come in and support. I think some of those things can be potentially looked at and explored when we think about smart proteins.
Great, thank you. So I guess globally, everyone agrees we're at an inflection point. From an India point of view, Jinesh, based on your interactions with startups, what has emerged as some of the key hurdles we need to cross to get there and participate in this kind of global trend?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few different areas. I think one is an area, of course, where we're jumping in as a HIMSA VC to bring in the capital. That's one of the blockers for early stage companies in this space. like several of the panelists and you mentioned, the ecosystem is growing, academia, the government, grants. There's a lot of things happening, and including GFI, doing a great job of getting everyone aware. We work closely with the ecosystem. Funding it in early stage is one of the blockers for them, which we're trying to solve. Other than that, there is also kind of a gold rush feeling sometimes, where a lot of entrepreneurs are jumping in, and which is great for the sector overall. But then we see very few entrepreneurs who are able to truly understand how to commercialize and scale, and think of that roadmap ahead and keep on constantly adapting, knowing how to differentiate. That's the other piece, which is in the world of food, defending IP in India is pretty much close to impossible, I would say. Perhaps I'm being subtle when I say that. So that's one of the other things. One other area we see where we come in early with investments is bringing in good strategic partners for some of these founders and startups that come from, at the end of the day, alternative protein is still a food product. It's the food industry, right? It's maybe differently made product, but the supply chains in the back end, the partners in the space, logistics, distribution, sourcing of agricultural inputs, it's all the same. Of course, and we have more to innovate in those areas always. But being able to bring in the right partners for these startups, you yourself have supported so many companies where you bring in that value to these companies other than just the capital. I think that's sort of one sort of big piece, both within India and then, like Pranav mentioned, we're potentially a huge export house. We've already started doing that, several of the companies in India, helping them forge those international relationships. And I would love for founders to think more and more about not being just an Indian company. You could be an Indian startup, but you have to think globally here in this space. That's the only way to truly, one, survive right now until we hit an inflection point where demand truly grows in India for these startups. And two, just to understand that they're not playing just a local game. Overall, they have to compete with the kind of products, companies, price points, distribution models that global companies are working on. So we do have some advantages. But at the same time, I think the ecosystem coming together, like Shreyans mentioned, don't be an investor just putting capital. Bring in proper strategic value add on. And I know a lot of investors say that, but this space right now being more of a nascent space in India, obviously it was even more nascent 5 years ago. Now it's looking beautiful. Still, we're early in this space. I think bringing the strategic value add, truly working with your founders every week, every month, not getting in their way, but truly helping them shape up their companies. I think that's where we see truly bringing about acceleration in the change in the growth of this industry.
So I guess the question, Pranav, for you is, you touched about distribution also, Jinesh, and Licious obviously has created a great playbook of finally delivering to the customer and solving for a lot of problems. And even today when we were having the boot camp, I think there was a question on distribution, logistics, and all that stuff. So is there something that you can share with founders here, some of the learnings from Licious?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the most important things we recognized early, and I'm glad we had the alignment with both Vivek and Abhay, is that we had to build the whole thing ourselves. There was no cold chain, there is no organized supply, the abattoir is run by the government, the farms are run by contract manufacturers. There are at least 18 different parties to orchestrate in order to deliver excellent quality product to your doorstep, right? And not surprising, that's very expensive to do, especially for a company that raised 2.5 crores in the seed round. So we had a big uphill climb ahead of us, and I think getting that alignment early just trained all of us to make sure that we weren't making compromises along the way that would prevent us from getting to the end state. So I think a lot of the companies we meet in areas that are new, such as this specific one, if you're creating the category and therefore the boundaries that are typically drawn for other startups, where is the competition, where is the frontier, where are the stakeholders, where do their margins end? If that isn't clearly defined, define it first before you raise funding, before you start a company. I think that's really important. Second, I mentioned this before, but it's happening now in Smart Proteins as well. Work backwards from the product. If you're building a B2B company, I think there were some phenomenal teams pitching here today at the showcase. But if your product costs 1.5 times the standard mainstream alternative today, that is going to be a big barrier because pricing in the end is where everyone's margins get crunched. So that's going to be a really uphill sell. So work backwards from the experience that your procurers want from you, and then don't make compromises, but figure out how to be a reliable partner on that supply chain. That's a great way to start the business and eventually get to your end state. On the B2C side, of course, with food, I think that was a great point made. You cannot compromise. Consistency and trust are absolutely key. And your customers are not going to forgive you because this is hard to do. Every meal is important, and there's a ton of competition for every meal in this country today. So I think the stakes are quite high when you're dealing with food. And so distribution is not only how you manufacture and the procurement of your product manufacturing, it's also the distribution to the customer. And keeping all that within cost is extremely difficult to do. So I think there's just a lot to unpack. But I think the key lesson was doing all of that early and then building step by step. And we never spent more than we had. So it was, it looks exponential today, but it was hilariously painful in the first 3 years just to get the first 5 or 10 SKUs out the door.
And what was it? Do you remember what the second round was? So you're saying the first round was 2 crores?
The second round was 12 crores, 12 or 13 crores.
Okay. And do you remember what the revenues were that time?
40 lakhs a month.
40 lakhs a month.
Yeah.
Right. Great.
Yeah. So there was no revenue multiple for this industry. There still isn't, by the way.
Right.
Which is why Licious gets valued quite aggressively in a good year and not so
But maybe
well
it's getting
in a bad
valued
year.
also for the distribution then, because I guess the biggest pain point in India for most of the, I mean, even consumer products take still 7-8 days to get to, parts of the country,
So I think the power of Licious today is it does not sell a single frozen product. It is 100% fresh. So literally the only other competing experience is going and buying it straight from a butcher, the corner shop, the wet market. And you can see the difference just if you've experienced both. So how do you give the Licious experience but for fresh? And that is an entire supply chain innovation. It didn't exist. It still doesn't exist beyond Licious, right? And I think that's where the margins are as well, if you do that well. And that's why they had to build their tech. The tech is not on building a standard ERP. The tech is in getting that entire farm to plate literally, to be fresh within 24 hours.
And they own the full delivery
The whole thing.
chain.
Yep. It's their own staff. It's their own delivery boys. They have a special box for the back of the two-wheeler as well. It keeps the product between 0 and 2 degrees centigrade. So there's just this immaculate attention to detail that went into getting that company live.
Yeah. I guess that explains the valuations, I mean,
Of course. That's why we do it.
Great. So Shreyans and Karan, maybe each of you could comment. There's obviously an urgent need for pilot, demo, and commercial scale facilities now. What playbooks do you think can be borrowed from agri-tech and biotech for this sector?
Sure. I think one of the key ones is food, right? I think food is super complex. It's very important because each ingredient plays its own part in terms of getting the final product right. And that's where you don't see everyone sort of doing everything themselves. You have each player sort of really innovating and improving the product at one single level to be able to sort of get to that texture, that taste that the end consumer is asking for. And that's where you saw that in food very extensively, where people identified resources, people identified tools and systems with which they actually got to a stage where they were trying to understand from the very stage when the seed was developed to the stage where you are harvesting and how the movement of the good is happening to effectively processing it and then sort of getting that right quality that you sort of have stipulated for yourself when you are developing the end product. And I think with food that has been conditioned quite extensively, where you've gotten different players who have done this in the past, enough number of players who've been sort of very specialized on a particular type of a product and have been able to then supply to the Hindustan Unilever or even the Nestle's and the Lay's or the PepsiCo's of the world, in terms of being able to sort of manage through that supply chain and thereby develop the end product experience that the customers want. There is enough number of this ecosystems that got built as the product consumer experiences sort of started getting more involved, where people started asking for a particular type of product. Consumerism sort of effectively drove a lot of this too backward and sort of taking it a step to be able to sort of ensure that this standardizations start happening. And that's where we saw with food extensively this part of that chain sort of getting built out and this ecosystem getting built out. And I think that's where you see a lot of businesses effectively, there are parts of which where you want to sort of own that particular part of that business, which is primarily your IP in some ways. That's the piece that you are sort of effectively sort of owning, and you look for other right partners who can help you get to that next level. And that's what we've seen across, and just from that perspective within our portfolio as well, we see that across with different partners trying to sort of come in with the food expertise that a lot of our food companies have been able to do. And you have the end customers requiring that kind of product quality and experience that they want to sort of deliver to the end customer.
Just in terms of the capacity as well, right? India has a good history of food processing. We are known in the region as a very good industrial food processor. We're known globally for biotechnology. And this is the beauty of this sector, is that it is a marrying of the two. We're seeing biotechnology come into food, biomimicry come into the way we produce and consume. And this is where I see the opportunity. I joke around the office sometimes and I tell them that, listen, I think I want to just like invest in building biorefineries because I think there's enough of VC money out there to pay me to rent that stuff. So, but having said that, I think your pilot and initial production scale, I would love to see someone actually marrying that gap in terms of existing capacity that's there. I'm seeing that in the Western markets. I'm seeing businesses come out to actually say that, listen, you have a beer refinery or like a beer facility. When you're not producing beer, someone wants to pilot their meat or like whatever, the cell cultures over there. Marry those. We've got those capacities here. But what I find startups trying to do is everything. And I think that's where I would recommend founders as well, is that, think of the core problems that you want to solve and solve for them. Don't solve for things that are already out there, because those are things that you can well, they're easily solvable. So actually getting access to, say, like capacity or ingredients or whatever, right? Don't try and work completely backwards. Where is your core like IP? Try and work for that. What I see as the future is maybe in 3 or 4 years' time, we have a cell-based meat company like in India using like Licious' distribution chain. So maybe one day that happens. So we are there. I think we can accelerate that journey a lot faster. Capacity is there. We have a history of actually doing it. We've done it in the past. I think it's just about finding, focusing on what the core problem is and trying to solve for that.
Great. Thank you, Karan and Shreyans. So Maya, Green Earth has done a lot of innovative structuring and financing for clean technologies. Do you think it's possible? And if so, are there any innovative ways of using, say, blended finances like mezzanine financing, et cetera, and to kind of grow this sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start actually with a blanket statement, which is that I feel that there is a lot that can be done more creatively with finance across the board for climate and for different types of climate technologies. Specifically at Green Earth, we do believe that what exists right now from a climate finance perspective is somewhat limited, and it's very conventionally structured. So I think there is a role to play in innovation around finance, and it goes the entire spectrum of everything from sort of blended models to, as I said, concessional and different forms of debt. We have very little that's available right now that is actually fit for purpose in terms of the types of debt that are available, especially for sectors like this. And I think Karan also called out to the fact that there is an enormous opportunity for infra to be built. But for that to be built, that is CapEx, and that needs a certain type of support, which is not necessarily the type of support that VCs should be funding. So there is also an opportunity, and I alluded to this earlier, for different types of capital to come together to create a blended pool of funding where concessionary capital essentially comes in and enables a de-risking of certain markets or of certain technologies, at which point commercial capital can come in. Again, as I said, that has happened before, very much so with the energy space, and I think that hasn't happened yet. I think the case studies need to be built up, some success stories need to be shown, and then that's going to happen a lot more. And it also needs to happen intentionally. Blended finance does not happen organically. There have to be people who facilitate this. That's been our experience in the market. Everyone says they want it to happen. Nobody is quite sure how it should happen. So you need to have people who essentially put the pieces together, hold it together until kind of the next step of commercial finance, and then a success story has been created.
Okay, thank you. There's been an overall slowdown in venture capital investments, and people have turned more risk-averse. Deal making, volatility, economic slowdown, all of these things are questions which are, doing the rounds right now. So, Pranav, I just wanted to ask you about valuations. Do you find that they're too steep, and what price corrections or would be required, and how are generalist investors seeing this space? Is it they're not participating because of the market size, or is it because of valuations?
In India, so I can talk about India. I think we studied the US market. The primary reason for the consumer business to pick up is there's a moral or ethical call to being more responsible in your dietary choices. And that's why Beyond Meat, and there's a half a dozen companies that have scaled up quite nicely. I don't believe any investor thinks they've solved the taste issue, the cost issue, the distribution issue, or the format issue. The ready to cooks, ready to eats, what's procured at the restaurant. So it's still an industry that's being created, but it's being valued to perfection. And I think it's valued to perfection in a very good year, obviously. When that goes away, this is a pretty difficult time for some of those stocks now. We don't have those problems in India. First of all, this sector is not a moral or ethical claim on the B2C side yet. Secondly, it's still getting started. So the clear winner in the format, the clear winner in the product, the clear brand, the clear distribution strategy, all of that is up for definition. So we're in a very different part of the cycle compared to a large part of the West. And Singapore's, for example, got a very different part to this also. They're more lab and culture, and because they have less land, it's more intensive. Their approach to the entire sector is different. The cost profile is different. So I think every geo is figuring out a different approach to this specific product. I think we mentioned already, India has some significant advantages in this space. We can be the B2C and the B2B or export model. I think it's important for startups now to commit and start making that race to become the defining company of that specific model as quickly as possible. Capital comes as you're building it. Capital is not going to come in advance of it. And that's why I think valuations-wise, we're in a much more stable zone compared to the hype, the trend-based investing that the West went through over the last 3 years. Finally, I think from a allocation point of view, there is more responsible investing in India today compared to even 3 years back. There are more ESG funds, there are more ESG LPs. The whole capital chain is now much more sensitive to category creation and supporting that specific industry in a very different way compared to something else. So I think this space will also start seeing a lot more care and customization of capital requirements, and therefore what the end state looks like. You're not looking for 100x's anymore, 10, 15, 20x, whatever it is, depending upon the model. That would be a good start. So I think we just need to refactor and figure out how to define our companies a little bit more clearly. I think happens over the next couple of years from our point of view.
Yeah, agree totally, Karan. So, Karan, a question for you. Supply chain issues, price inflation, all of these things are adversely affecting startups in APAC. Do you see that as an opportunity in India for some of the ingredient players?
Yeah, definitely. Like clearly, as what Pranav just said, I think it's about founders now committing. This is the opportunity that we have, as an Indian startup ecosystem, building the next generation of food. The supply chain issues are only going to get tighter. Being involved in sustainable food and agri-value chains for the last 10 years myself, I am seeing a deglobalization of our food system. We are seeing, because of geopolitics, more regionalized supplies taking place. The de-risking from China, that's also happening. So these issues will stay. What is cyclical is inflation. Those are just business cycles. So I think startups in India definitely should be able to take advantage of this right now. Build good product. That should be the core of what they need to be doing. And a good product will sell regardless. You don't have to throw in hundreds of millions of dollars behind a good product for it to sell. Unit economics then start working out. You're not burning money at a gross level. And exports. We have our first investment in this space was ProEon. It was essentially for this reason, because we felt the B2Bs, the entire B2B ingredient space was completely untouched. It was controlled by 5 large companies in the world. And in India, 99% of it was being imported. All our concentrates, all our wheys are being imported. Still is. So with ProEon, we're hoping to change that. And there will be more. We do strongly believe that the ingredient space is going to be great. We're going to see a lot of demand coming from Southeast Asia. India already has exported plant-based meat to the US. That's great news for us. Will that continue? Okay, maybe. If it does, that's great. But we have the opportunity now, and it's low-hanging fruit. It's just about going back to what I said, just solving for the right problem and focusing on that and getting to the market as soon as you can.
Great. And Shreyans, in spaces like fermentation and cultivated meat, there's a question on gross margins. So what are your view for companies which are in pre-commercialization state?
Right, and I'm assuming this is for the funding aspect, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
from that perspective, I think there is, as Pranav mentioned, right? I think the market has different types of investors also, right? That who take in bets at different stages. And fundamentally for us as a fund at Ankur, we just sort of announced an investment into a cultivated meat company called MyWorks, right? So for us, it is about being able to sort of see how the technologies or products can get scaled up from 0 to 1 to 1 to 10 and 10 to 100, and different investors would come in at different stages. The market is so early that it is still awaited in terms of getting the fundamentals also right? The B2B plays will be very different from a B2C play, and fundamentally for a B2B play, the unit economics has to fit, right? And how does that then get impacted over to the consumers? Because if a product is getting priced at a 1.5x, you will need to work backwards and get your product price right to be able to sort of source the right products and effectively get to that price range which the market is asking for. In the B2B, it is also about being able to sort of really get the right efficiencies, right type of a product, which sort of is a market standard, or you're beating the market standard in some ways and being the gold standard, right? And that's what your larger aim is. And fundamentally in those aspects, the fundamentals of the business of gross margin and being able to sort of see value creation happening at each part in terms of how you are building cost-effective models are going to be important. And that's what we've seen. As a fund, you will have different types of investors who would come in probably at early stages, who are open to taking that risk, where in later stages, there might be investors who probably would ask the question on being able to sort of say and accordingly reward the companies.
So you all have taken that call that the gross margin will eventually come in?
Yeah, we believe so.
Right. Okay, great. So Jinesh, how are you seeing the funding environment right now shifting with this current slowdown? Are you seeing that impacting companies wanting to kind of raise money at cheaper valuations? And how are you guys approaching it?
Yeah, I think we're all sort of experiencing the effects of the slowdown folks to my left, all three of them, just mentioned some aspects around the slowdown, the valuation corrections. And I think founders do realize that, but I actually overall think that that correction that's come in right now, the valuation, is good from a fundamental perspective. Like I think earlier referred to this as a gold rush in a way, right? Everybody's want to jump in, and a lot of founders just look at the news of this company raised so much at that valuation, and the multiples are off the charts. But I think we're at a period now where there's a good balance between continued interest from investors in this domain and increasing interest, but at the same time, founders starting to realize that they will need to show more, progress, be their product, be their service, be their business revenues, before they can defend a sort of a hard multiple. And I think the startup world is full. The startup graveyard, there's a whole website dedicated to this, is full of stories of founders in the past, different cycles, the up cycles, the down cycles, raising funding at really high valuations, then having to have down rounds and eventually shutting down. So I think the smart founders, the right investors are all realizing that perhaps being a little more conservative about their valuation is only right. I also talked to several companies that we talked to, say, 6 months ago or a year ago, where their ask has now, the amount of funding they want to raise itself is, for example, gone down a bit, not because they see less capital flowing in. Our sector, for example, is, I think, continuing to grow. The all-protein sector globally and in India continues to grow in terms of investments coming in, rather than slowing down. But the reason why they're asking for less capital sometimes is realizing that let's raise a little less capital, let's prove our worth a bit more, let's hit some of those milestones in the next 6, 12, 18 months, be it on the technical R&D side, or be it on the commercialization side, or be it on the partnership side, then go out and raise more capital, and make sure that that capital is coming in from strategic investors. As much as founders look at this gold rush, a lot of investors are also looking at this as a bit of a gold rush, with caution, of course, but then taking on the right investors on board at the right valuation. I think the corrections are good. It's a good thing for the industry overall.
Great, thanks. Maya, so most of the climate finance is going towards energy. What specific principles can be looked at by development finance institutions, philanthropies, to support a transition to protein?
So I think there's an enormous opportunity, and it's the opportunity, or it's the role that philanthropic capital should almost always play, which is to be catalytic to an ecosystem. Once that happens, everyone at this panel will essentially come in and do the rest and take the companies forward. But there isn't enough funding that's going into market making, into some of the basic infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, very broad, I don't just mean the plants, equipment, and machinery. I mean also just everything that's needed to connect different pieces together. So there isn't enough funding that's going into that. Some of these support and capacity building areas, some of these labs that we've talked about before, all of those need to be funded by someone where the returns are many, many years away. And that's, again, not necessarily going to align with your typical VC funding pattern. And so that has to be supported more likely by concessional or grant funding. And I think, finally, there is an enormous role to be played around catalyzing more capital. So doing the hard work around risk mitigation, or at least risk discovery, because that's the biggest piece that holds commercial funders back, not knowing how to price the risk. Once that's been priced, then the market will take over.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, but that's what EVs and energy have got the advantage of. And I think one thing that probably we could do is try to figure out how we could include plant proteins and this whole movement as part of a CSR activity, because indirectly it is also helping climate.
So I think the missing piece over here is that, and we've spoken to a number of different foundations and people on the philanthropic side. So far, it's early days now that they are starting to recognize this as also being an impactful sector. It's about the framing of the impact that is being created by this sector. And again, I've used this word before, but showcasing some of those metrics showcasing some of those success stories. That is what I think is required to bring more philanthropic funding in. It's not yet seen as creating the same kind of impact as some of the other things that CSR funding typically goes towards. That's a challenge there, and that's really that's a framing and a messaging challenge.
Yeah. So I guess it's up to institutions and us to kind of create the awareness within the community that this is a new space. It has a huge impact on, you have all the statistics on methane production and carbon emissions.
So it has an impact on, it has a climate impact, it has a nutrition impact, it has a health impact, it has a livelihoods impact. So all of those need to be called out more strongly.
Yeah, no, look, just at that point, and I think at the sake of probably just being crucified, but I think this has to be said, is that, look, just the alternative proteins, and let's just talk about that. What we really require is similarly to what we said, Monday to Sunday, Roj Kha one day. Now I think that sort of push from what we've seen from government and NECC, that needs to change, is that, look, we don't need Monday to Sunday ande. We need Sunday ka ande. Monday to Saturday, we need alternatives to that. And that's how we as a country also meet our NDC goals from reducing GHGs in the food system through moving away from predominantly animal agriculture.
I think one good thing that's happened is there is a movement of creation of an association industry body. If you look at the US where I grew up, milk was really advertised. It was a government initiative, or association initiative where people were advertising and made you believe that you have to have 1 glass of milk a day. So I remember growing up and you'd see these advertisements on TV. So I think it's not only up to the founders, but I think it's up to the investors also to go back to their LPs and also make them realize that this sector has a huge impact on health, on climate. It's our responsibility to go back and tell corporates that this is part of the CSR budget. You need to be able to provide some capital to the space. You can't have the same expectations that you have putting money into a tech startup because this is a new category. Having said, and recognizing the fact that with our population, our young, I used to own a stake in a large influencer platform. The 18 to 26 people care so much about climate. And this space is a convergence of health, climate, and people who care about animals. That, if we can get all of these movements right, there is a market there for people to adopt. And I think it's about creating that awareness, So I guess there's a lot of work to be done. I'm going to sum up the session. You guys have been a great audience, quiet. I don't know if it was how interesting we were or the nice lunch. But anyway, I think some key points, there are many good points, but just I think trying to make sure that I think distribution was a standout point. It came up even in the boot camp that we did, which is I think owning your own distribution or collaborating and finding innovative ways. Don't just wait for the traditional distribution system. 30% of your gross margins are actually getting consumed in distribution and in the cold chain, which is very, very complex. And therefore, if you want to really own this category, you need to be innovative in solving for that. Try and leverage the existing infrastructure of manufacturers, find co-manufacturers. It's true in Europe and all of them. Many of them have shifted a part of their production to plant-based. So go back to an existing manufacturer and see if you can convince him. Go after ESG investors and as we talked about corporates and family offices. If you look at Europe, there's been a major boom in family offices allocating to the sector. Blue Horizon is trying to raise $1 billion right now fund from $200 million 18 months ago, post-COVID, because so many families want to allocate capital to the sector, Deglobalization of food, I think that's a very important trend. And I think recognizing the fact that we have a strong agri base, we have a strong bio base, and leveraging that to kind of innovate and think about some unique IP-based ideas rather than just doing a simple kebab and a sheikh kebab. And I think that's played out, and I think the market needs more innovation. And setting a goal for all of us to make sure that we become one of the largest funding kind of capitals in Asia. We see Singapore, China, which is such a small market, China, Hong Kong, all of these guys are having rounds bigger than us. Why can't we be that place to, set up kind of a stick in the ground? So with that, I close. Thank you.